Welcome back. Just a little reminder, please, if you can keep the aisles and the walkways free. This is for everyone's security. Would really appreciate that. Thank you. So, on to our next session. Nanhi Kali, Nutrition and the Girl Child. Nandana Sen, Ruchira Gupta and Shashi Tharoor in conversation with Keshav Desiraju. And this session is presented by Nestle. Please, a very warm welcome to our speakers. Thank you.
Friends, welcome on Nutrition and the Girl Child. Before I request our very, very interesting speakers to speak on this subject, we have a short film made by Bharat Bala, Shankar Ehsan Loy, and our sponsors for the afternoon, Nestle. If I could just request that that be played. Yeah, they can see it. Are we seeing that? Is anyone?
स्कूल की घंटी चल कागज कश्ती लेके जहाँ स्याही के सागर पे दुनिया हम देखेंगे पढ़ लिख लेंगे सोचिए बदलेगी साथ दे अपने भी सर उठा दुनिया से हम आगे चल देंगे नए से ख्वाबों को जोड़ हिसाबों में सर उठा दुनिया से हम आगे चल देंगे बजती जब सोच की घंटी रे बजती जब स्कूल की घंटी रे बच्चों की फौजें चलती है काका की कुट्ठी खुलती रे स्कूल चली मैं 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 स्कूल चली मैं
Thank you. Friends, very quickly, our speakers for this afternoon. We have Nandana Sen, child rights activist, author, actor, and has worked very closely with, and has made films for children, and has worked with UNICEF in the the campaign against child abuse. We have Ruchira Gupta, activist, feminist activist, teacher, writer, internationally acclaimed, who set up an organization that fights trafficking against women. And we look forward to hearing from her. Then we have Dr. Shashi Tharoor, who this audience needs no introduction to, but who I recognize this afternoon as a member of parliament. And he will doubtless have a lot to say to us about how issues such as nutrition, girls' education, girls' health are considered highest policy-making levels. Now, before I request our speakers to speak, there are just 4 factoids that I would just like to place before the audience, something you need to keep in mind. The first of these is that in India, far fewer girl children are born than ought to be born. The child sex ratio is still appallingly skewed. The All India average is 964 girls for every 1,000 boys born. Some states are much worse than others. Kerala is significantly better. Haryana, Rajasthan, significantly worse. It is a fact to remember. Infant mortality, we have succeeded in substantially bringing down infant mortality in our country, but we are still nowhere near good enough. And interestingly, amongst infants who die, the consistent trend across states is that more girls than boys die. Something else to keep in mind. The third fact that I'd like everyone to think about is last year, the Global Hunger Index, which included in its calculations the percentage of what they call stunting and wasting amongst children, placed India at 97 out of 118 countries that were surveyed. That is not a good figure. And the fourth fact that I want to place before you is that we're talking about nutrition, but we also need to remember that nutrition, adequate nutrition, is just a means to everything else that a girl child or indeed even a boy child can do, whether it is education or whether it is access to opportunities or anything else that she wants to do with her life. So we look at nutrition not just for the sake of nutrition per se, but because of what it implies. Having said that, I would now like to request Nandana, if you will please take the mic.
Hello? Yes. Well, it's wonderful to be a part of this panel. We all have such different backgrounds and experiences in terms of the work that we've done with children. But I feel we would all agree, and perhaps all of you would agree, that it is impossible to look at girl-child nutrition in isolation from the other sectors with which it is intimately connected, such as healthcare and education, women's employment, sanitation, etc. What is critical about the girl child is not only, about the well-being of the girl child, is not only her nutrition, but the fact that she gets caught in this codependent grid of gender discrimination very, very early on, and it becomes very difficult to get out of it. And there are no better manifestations of this gender discrimination than some of the figures relating to the sex ratio and infant mortality that you shared just now. In India, a girl child is more than 50% likely to die between the age of 1 and 4 than a boy child. And this happens because right from birth, we know this, right from birth, boys get far better healthcare, far better nutrition, far better medical attention. They get breastfed much more quickly and for much longer periods. They get the better foods, they get the proteins, the girls get the greens. When there is a food shortage, we know that the boys get the food, the girls get what's left or nothing at all. But not only in nutrition, but also in terms of healthcare, it takes a girl to be severely sick for her to be taken into a hospital. Boys get taken into hospitals much more quickly. They get access to medications, they get antibiotics, they get oral rehydrations when they have diarrhea. But the lapses in healthcare that the girls face create a kind of vicious cycle between undernourishment and sickness, because of the parasitic diseases that the girl child goes through, her ability to absorb nutrients gets severely affected, and therefore she gets stuck in the cycle. So this is what we need to look at, not just what nutrition, what the status of girl child nutrition is right now, which there are some indicators to show that the picture is better now than it was 10 years ago. Marginally, perhaps. It's not as severe. Some things, such as BMIs, are not as severe as they were before, those differentials. But still, the problem is enormous. The other area that I mentioned, which is directly related to girl child nutrition, is, of course, education. We know that a child whose mother has no education is 50%, is 5 times more likely to be severely underweight than a child of a mother who has had at least 12 years of education. And yet, as a nation, we still have not learned to prioritize girl-child education. We still continue with the prevalence of child marriage. So if you have a an undernourished girl child being married and giving birth to another undernourished girl child and has no education, there is no way one can avoid the intergenerational propagation of undernutrition. So it's extremely important to stress education, to find ways of keeping girls in schools and to get rid of child marriage. And what's connected to keeping girls in schools, again, is infrastructure. So that too is connected to girl-child nutrition. Girls drop out of schools because it's difficult for them to travel to school. We don't have safe roads. They don't go to school once they start menstruating because they don't have toilets. So if we build the toilets, if we build the infrastructures, we can keep the girls in school, and they will be better. They will be generally, most importantly, their general well-being will be hugely improved, but also they will be able to take care of their children better. And of course, the advantage of being able to go to school and not dropping out is that they also have access to the midday meal program, which is a program that has worked brilliantly in most states, although we hear that fundings are being cut. And there are also plans of fortifying the midday meal with the needs of the adolescent girls in particular in mind. So speaking of adolescent girls, one of the things that I wanted to say is that I think it is important to, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it too. I think it's really important to focus specifically on the needs of the adolescent girl child, partly because her nutritional needs are different, are very specific. Also because we know that in our country, over 64 million adolescent girls are severely anemic, which leads to very critical risks later on in life. And there are actually schemes that are paying attention to them and that are working well, such as the Sabla program, which gives integrated packages of service and food to services and nutrients to adolescent girls. Then there are programs like the KGBVP program, which takes girls into boarding schools, girls who are undernourished and neglected, and the difference that we've seen in the way their lives have changed once they've gone into these schools is really extraordinary. So we certainly don't want fundings to be cut from those. The other point that I want to make about adolescence is it's a slightly different one. I think it would be great if we would recognize the role that adolescents can play not only as beneficiaries of these programs, but as our partners in development. Because what I learned in my work in UNICEF and with Rahi is that adolescent advocates have tremendous power in bringing about change.
Yes.
And in fact, there's a program in Rajasthan, it's run by Antara Foundation, where they have a network of adolescent girls who work very closely with the community in the Akshada program, which is their maternal and child health program. And they go around giving children immunizations, making sure pregnant women are eating green vegetables and getting their folic acid. They make sure undernourished children, girl children, get the treatment that they need. And I think this level of engagement is so important in behavior change. And I feel that as a nation, we can channelize the determination and passion that our adolescents have to bring about change.
Thank you. Dr. Tharoor, can I ask you to come in here?
Yeah, well, I agree with everything Nandana has said. I mean, I have to say that when I was first asked to join this panel with such well-known activists in a cause that I only dabbled in as an amateur, I was kind of reminded of an episode in my early UN days in the pre-email era, when I got a call on a very bad telephone line asking me, I thought, to come and make a speech on press freedom. So I went there prepared to speak about press freedom, and I got there and discovered it was a meeting on breastfeeding. Now, of course, the UN being the UN, I managed somehow. But I suppose we members of parliament also get stuck with an expectation of malevolence that I'm not sure I've merited. But let me add a couple of things to what Nandana said. First of all, there is no question, you said it already, Keshav, disparity is great. We've got huge differences in the way in which our girls are nourished versus how boys are nourished. It's explained by socio-cultural factors, etc., but it's still unacceptable generally and unacceptably high in practice. Now, there's been significant improvements in India's nutritional standards since independence. We've actually made major strides, and yet we are amongst the worst in the world, which is rather sad, because in fact, we're on track to meeting only 2 of the 8 globally accepted targets on nutrition. We have now the new Sustainable Development Goals the UN has come up with. We really need to align our national work towards those. The fact is that there still is, I'm sorry to say, 40 million stunted children under the age of 5 and a further 17 million wasted children, that is severely malnourished children in our country. And the other problem we have is massive disparities and variations among states. So you can get positive stories coming out of places like my home state of Kerala, or yours, I think, of Tamil Nadu. Manipur is actually a surprising success story. Goa, perhaps a little more predictable. And then you get some pretty dismal stories coming out of Bihar, Jharkhand, Uttar Pradesh. And it's about fundamental issues in our country, issues of inequality, issues of access to food, issues of access to fair treatment. And don't forget that, you know, as Nandana was already saying, this connects to all sorts of other things. You know, for example, our public health crisis. The fact is that if you have a malnourished child, lower body weight explains 50% of the tuberculosis cases in our country. And of course, a malnourished child is also stunted mentally very often, their well-being is affected, and the country as a whole suffers. Delivery of services is something that we, as public figures, have to be concerned about. I've discovered that food provided by the integrated child development services the government pushes reaches barely 1 in 5 children in UP, but it reaches 90% in Odisha. Or Nagaland, only 33% of children are fully immunized. In Goa, 90% are fully immunized. About 80% of children in Odisha are defecating in the open. Practically no one in Kerala is. So these discrepancies show that we're getting it right in some places and getting it wrong in others. And as a result, the country as a whole is losing out on the talents and capacities of its children. Education is hugely important. Even before I worked in the Human Resources Development Ministry, I used to hammer away at the importance of girls' education. It became my sort of 2-word mantra. There's no such thing as a magic bullet in development, but the closest thing certainly is the 2-word mantra, educate girls. Because of all the things, again, Nandana has touched on this, that an educated girl is able to have a sort of ripple effect on her children. An educated girl, even with 5 years of education, Nandana mentioned 12, but even with 5 years of education, there are studies showing they're themselves more productive, their children are healthier, it's easier for them to understand the importance of boiling water, of washing hands, of actually getting the kids to be immunized, all of this stuff. An educated woman tends to be an empowered woman, is therefore able to have more of a say on things like how many children she has, the spacing and frequency of her children, and thereby give them better nutrition. Because she's educated, she understands the value of both genders, and she doesn't discriminate as much against a girl child as an uneducated woman does, and so on and so forth. There's example after example. And of course, since children of any gender will spend more time with their mothers in their formative years of life than with anybody else, an educated mother also has a tremendously salutary impact on the child, boy or girl, growing up. So the Gandhian line, Mahatma Gandhi's famous line, that if you educate a boy, that's a good thing, but you're educating a person. If you educate a girl, you are educating a family and transforming a society. That is absolutely true. So those are the main things I wanted to say on this topic. I want at some point after Ruchira has also spoken to drag the conversation towards what we can do about this, because I think a lot of what we're good at in India is diagnosing problems. We're less good at prescribing solutions and even worse at implementing them. So maybe that's what I'd like to take the conversation to if you give me a second round on this after Ruchira.
Yeah, thank you. You did an important question of why do some states get it right and some don't. I hope we have the time to come back to that. Dr. Gupta?
Thank you, Nandana and Shashi, for laying out the ground so beautifully. And I'm going to take off from the fact that Shashi mentioned Gandhiji, because at one point, Gandhiji was asked by a British reporter that, Mr. Gandhi, why do you always travel third class? And he said, because there is no fourth class. So today I'm here to talk to you about the fourth class for the girl child, the most destitute of all the girls we know, and who is deprived of food to such an extent that she goes to bed hungry every night, and there are 6 million such girls in our country. These girls go to bed hungry every night. And how did I come upon this data or this statistic is through my own work. As many of you know in the room who I can see, I work among prostituted women and their children in the red light areas of India, in Bihar, in Calcutta, Delhi, Haryana, Rajasthan, Bombay, Bhiwandi. And at one point, I found that the children were not paying attention in school, even though their mothers wanted to send their daughters to school. And I couldn't understand why they were not paying attention, because they were so desperate to be in a classroom. And I began to ask them, why are you not listening? Why are you playing around? Why don't you just pay attention to this opportunity? And one girl said, because I'm hungry. And because she said that, I got all the children in the classroom checked, and they all were suffering from malnourishment. Malnourishment is just another word for hunger. And so we started a midday meal program in our schools across these red light areas. And because we could not afford much, we began to give 1 egg a day to each child. And recently I was in Bihar, and I saw that one of the girls was putting that egg into her pocket, and she did not eat it in class. And I said, what happened? And she said, I'm taking it home to share it with my mother, my brother, and my younger sister. And that is the level of hunger that we are talking about. When we talk about the manifestations of this hunger, as Nandana said, as Shashi said, stunting, anemia, what is called underweight or wasting. All these things happen to that girl. She suffers from chronic fatigue. She has to get married by the time, if she survives all of this, if she doesn't get a disease and die early, what happens is that she'll get married early. She herself is malnourished and hungry. Her body is not fully formed, and then she has to give birth to another child before she's given birth to herself fully. Maternal mortality rates in our country are really high. The one thing that independent India has tackled, while I'm painting this picture of gloom and doom, is that we have brought down infant mortality in the 70 years. And we have tried to tackle the inequality of hunger to a large extent. And we were making some gains. But in 2015, budgets for women and children were cut by 50%, 47% actually. And that led to the slashing of midday meal programs in schools, what Nandana was talking about, the children being fed in schools. There were schools which had to slash all their midday meal programs because there was simply no money. Anganwadis, where poor women were cooking for children. They were not getting salaries. They could not buy vegetables, rice or dal to cook for the children. In Jharkhand, schools itself were closed down because education budgets were slashed by 27%. And so the Kasturba Gandhi Balika Vidyalaya schools were closed, where tribal girls could go to school, study safely, and be able to build a future for themselves. All this happened in the last 3 years. In 2015, there was a budget cut. In 2016, there was another budget cut. For ICDS, Indian Integrated Child Development Scheme, the budget was cut from 18 crores to 8 crores. And in the meantime, defense budgets went up. And today, India is the 3rd largest buyer of arms in the world. We've crossed Russia. After America and UK, we spend the most on defense. We are spending almost $40 billion. That's the trend. And even $1 billion out of that allocated to women and children would be enough to feed them and clothe them and send them to school. And the budget is round the corner again on 1st February, and I don't know what's going to happen to schools, what's going to happen to meals, what's going to happen to the women cooking for the children, what's going to happen to access to women's health care. Even that is being cut. And of course, we have Mr. Desiraju with us who can talk about access to health care for women and intergenerational malnutrition. And then, of course, you know what all this leads to? It's all interconnected, as Nandana and Shashi were talking about, from eating to be able to go to school, to be able to pay attention in school, from being able to go to school to access a livelihood, from accessing a livelihood to being able to follow their whole potential. All of these choices are taken away from so many of our girls. And these girls are, as Gandhiji would say, the last girls, you know, the 4th class that I was talking about. They are not just girls, they're already unequal because they are born girls, but they are also poor, they are low caste, and they are teenagers. So they suffer from such a choicelessness in our country that traffickers have begun to take advantage of them. India has become the epicenter for trafficking rings in our world. They are put into prostitution. 1.4 million girls are trapped in brothels all over our country. And more every day. The ages are going down, the numbers are going up. So we really have a very grim situation on our hands. And a journalist today just asked me, she said, but don't we have to spend on defense? Because if we don't protect our country, how will the girls live? But if the girls don't live, who are we protecting? And that is the more fundamental question we have. And so really, I'm so glad that we have the opportunity to be able to talk about these issues among ourselves. And there's been a lot of talk about post-truth, fake news, democracy. But until the democracy is inclusive and reaches the last, Gandhiji's concept of Antodaya, we will not be able to change anything. There are lots of programs that the government has announced which are completely underfunded and are branding exercises. So there's one called Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao. But how is the Beti going to be saved if she cannot eat, if she goes to bed hungry? And Nandana said that she can't even walk to school. How is she going to be mobile if she doesn't have the body to be able to walk to school? And then the other program, Swachh Bharat, which is talking about toilets. Girls don't have roofs over their head. They don't have clothes to wear. The same question that Gandhiji faced when he was in Champaran, it's 100 years of the Champaran Satyagraha now in 1917. He finished his act of civil disobedience and said he would not leave the district because he had come there to obey a higher conscience, and he was documenting the plight of indigo farmers. He was walking around the district to do some constructive program, as he called it, and he was trying to help villagers live better. And he saw many dirty women, and he asked Kasturba to go to one of these women and tell them that you must bathe every day and wear a clean sari. And the woman responded by asking Kasturba that how can I wear a clean sari and how can I bathe every day when I have only one sari? Can the Mahatma give us a second sari? And today, girls in many parts of our country are facing the same problem. If they don't get school uniforms, if budgets are cut for that, how will they go to school? They have only one set of clothes. And I've seen this in the work that I do. In Jharkhand, after these budget cuts under the present government, so many boarding schools have been cut that the trafficking of tribal girls has gone up. And these are issues we have to confront because, everything is a branding exercise. But, what do you do with a toilet when you cannot eat? What do you do with a toilet when you don't have a home? How do you go to school? How do you educate a girl when she's hungry? And these are the basic fundamental questions that we have to revisit constantly because freedom itself is an everyday struggle. Thank you.
Thank you. We do need to turn this over to the House, but there's one question which any one of you who wishes to can answer. What you say is what we know. I think instinctively, people who have not even studied the subject know this. Why is it not important at the political or policy level? Why are these issues, what you say is so impressive, but why is there a sense that no one is listening?
One of the things is that slowly development paradigms have been defined by something called SMART, SMART, specific, measurable, achievable, results-oriented, time-bound. And that has limited what we do, because what that has done is pushed us, trying to achieve what can be done quickly, what can be numbered, counted, and catalogued. And therefore, we go for something called the lowest hanging fruit, and we don't try to go to places which are the hardest and the most difficult, the last girl that I'm talking about. In fact, I once had a conversation with Nike Foundation, and they said, Ruchira, we agree that we need to go there, but it's too difficult, and allocating resources there is harder.
Let me ask Shashi what he has to say.
No, well, I think that some of us have made a noise. I don't want to be too immodest, but I did raise in Parliament, in my budget speech, the question of the cut of the ICDS budget from 80 crores to 8. Now, the argument usually given by governments is resources. Now, in this particular case, they took shelter behind the argument that the Finance Commission is giving more money to the states. And so the states can make up for what the center is cutting. But in fact, that doesn't work that way. And in fact, this kind of cut the states will not be able to compensate for. But apart from that, there's a fundamental issue of political priorities. And there, I think Ruchira is right. Our government at the moment is not particularly interested in welfare measures and in giving money for things like health programs, children's programs, Anganwadis. The budgets for Anganwadi has been cut to such a ridiculous extent. I got Menaka Gandhi to admit in Parliament that she actually doesn't have enough money to even pay the nominal honorarium that we're giving Anganwadi workers, let alone to give food or eggs or toys or whatever else to the kids. So the only Anganwadis that are working in our country are the ones that states are supporting and that private people are supporting. So that if I can come to the challenge of policy, I think we do need desperately to get our government together to focus on these issues, which means cutting across agencies. If you leave it to a marginalized ministry like Women and Child Development, it won't happen. And you know this, you were health secretary, so that's where the clout is. We have to strengthen the ICDS and give it more funding. We also have to leverage the PDS, the public distribution system, our rations and so on, because that can be used also to give more nutritional food to our children. We do need desperately to improve basic sanitation practices. Building toilets is all very well, but getting people to wash hands before and after eating. I'm astonished that even in a literate place like Kerala, there's such a major gap in this. Again, partly because we have water shortages everywhere, but that is a very serious issue. We've not given enough thought to an agricultural policy. We have an agricultural ministry, but we don't have a policy that actually looks at the nutritional needs of this country and says, we will subsidize or give tax incentives or whatever to more nutritious foods and grains, that kind of thing. And finally, I think we also need to get the private sector involved, get them into PPP projects, whatever. Let's get some resources into the system to compensate for these budgetary shortfalls.
Thank you. We have time for 2 questions. If the gentleman here.
Hello, everybody. My question is to all of you. I would like to ask you that every time a new government is formed, there is always the money to buy new cars for the legislators. There's always the money to buy a new helicopter for the chief minister. Why isn't the money there to feed the girl child? First question. Second, as Madam has already said, that the government is cutting down budget of these child organizations. I would like to ask Nandana. She has worked on the field, I'm sure. How much of what the government says is actually true? How much of it is being actually being done on the ground level, or is it just only on paper?
How much of what the government says?
How much of what the government says? How much of the government, the budget which the government passes?
Right.
How much of it actually gets passed on to the actual cause? You have worked on the ground
Yes.
level. You must have seen it with your eyes.
Sure.
Right?
And there are big differences. In some states, the efficacy is much better than in others. But certainly, even in my state, I have seen, if you look at something like the midday meal program, for instance, which has generally been a great program across the country, but there are certainly many cases that had come to me when I was working at NCPCR, where the midday meal budget was taken by the principal and the children didn't get the meals and they didn't even know that they were entitled to it. So we have some great policies now, but the outreach about them, the people don't know, the children don't know what they're entitled to. The parents don't know what the rights of their children are. The communication about it, which should really be done by the government, is very, very poor. I mean, as you said, Beti Bacha, what does that actually mean? It is so generic. And when you were talking about that, I was remembering a campaign that Bangladesh started over 40 years ago. And you know, Bangladesh is doing amazingly well in terms of this. There is no, whether it's the gender ratio, whether it's girl-child mortality, girl-child education, it is absolutely stellar in what it has achieved. They had this campaign 40 years ago, which is very simple and brilliant. It just said, Chele hok, meye hok, duti shantani jotheshto, which means be it a boy or girl, 2 are enough. But it was, the message was 2 are enough, but the way they phrased it made a huge difference to how the whole nation started looking at girls and boys. So I think there is a lot that has to be done in terms of letting the people know. And another problem that I think that happens, which I found in the field work, is that very often the frontline workers who are actually interacting with the community are women, right? Whereas the higher level decision makers, like doctors and pharmacists, those are the ones that the men listen to, right? The men do not listen to the women, and therefore the behavior change, and those men are not involved in outreach at all. So the behavior change messages never reach the men. So there needs to be more male participation on both ends of the outreach, the one who's reaching out and the one who's taking it.
Thank you. Madam, the lady here, the last question.
Good morning. I'm just a 10-second context before I ask my question. I'm a 9th class student from Jaipur, and ma'am, I had no idea that this was the depth and scale of our problem. So miss, what I'm going to do is, I study in an international school, which is around villages, and I see poor children on the street all the time. So miss, you've given me inspiration. I'm going to talk to my principal, and we're going to start something. We're going to start an initiative for those girls.
Thank you. That's an excellent suggestion.
My question is, my question is that, miss, where can I find more about these statistics and this information and knowledge? I had no idea about all of this. Like, where can I go to learn more?
Ruchira, do you want to quickly respond to that?
Yeah, you can look at the UNICEF website. A lot of the data is on the website of UNICEF India, as well as UNICEF globally. Some of the trafficking data is on the website of my NGO also, apneaap.org, apneaap.org. So,
and if you Google, you'll find a lot of reports by NGOs, think tanks. Brookings has done a good one. There's a global nutrition report. There are several that you can find all these facts and figures in.
Right. Thank you. Well, thank you all very much. That was an extremely important and interesting session. Thank you to my colleagues on the dais, and thank you to all of you. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Another very insightful session. Thank you very much to